The blisters spread across Milo's small back like a map of some cruel country, and Elian knew, kneeling beside the pup's shaking body in the dim light of the nursery, that morning would not come soon enough to save him. Nora, barely older than her brother, lay curled against the wall, her breath rattling, her tiny claws digging into the blanket, as if she could hold on to her own strength through sheer will alone. The healer had come and gone twice that night, shaking her head, murmuring words like fever of the old blood and nothing left to try. The pack's medicine had failed, the herbs were spent, the candles in the nursery burned low, and with them, so did any ordinary hope. Elian pressed a damp cloth to Milo's forehead and felt the pup flinch even in his sleep. He was not a healer. He was not a warrior, not a noble, not anyone the pack looked to for answers. He was an Omega, the lowest rank in the Alpha King's court, a keeper of small tasks and smaller expectations. He scrubbed floors. He carried firewood. He was, by the standards of everyone around him, unremarkable. But he loved these pups the way some people love their own blood, fiercely and without condition, and that love was now pushing him toward a decision that could cost him everything. He remembered a story his grandmother used to tell him when he was young, back before the pack took him in, back when the old ways still mattered to people, instead of just decorating their ceremonies. She spoke of a fountain in the heart of the kingdom, blessed by the first alphas, waters said to carry a memory of healing, so old that no sickness born of ordinary flesh could survive its touch. The sacred fountain, she called it, her voice hushed like she was naming something dangerous. Only the bloodline may enter its waters, she'd warned him. Only the king and his kin. For anyone else, it is forbidden. Elian had never believed the tale held any truth beyond comfort for frightened children. Until tonight, when comfort was the only thing left standing between two pups, and a fate no one wanted to speak aloud. He looked at Milo's fevered face, then at Nora's trembling shoulders, and made his choice before fear could argue him out of it. The fountain sat at the center of the palace gardens, surrounded by ancient stone walls, carved with symbols older than the kingdom's written history. It was lit at night by soft blue lanterns that the guards changed every evening, more for tradition than necessity, since almost no one ever came this way after dark. The area was restricted, marked with warnings that had kept generations of pack members at a respectful distance. Elian had passed by it 100 times while performing his duties, and never once thought he would enter its waters. Tonight, he wrapped Milo and Nora in warm blankets, lifted them both against his chest, and slipped out through the servants' corridor that ran along the edge of the palace. His heart pounded so loudly he was certain the guards would hear it before they saw him. But the halls were empty, the moon high and indifferent, and for once, luck seemed willing to walk beside him. He reached the garden gate and paused, feeling the full weight of what he was about to do settle over him like a heavy cloak. Breaking pack law was not a small offense. Trespassing on sacred ground was treated as an act against the pack's ancestors themselves, a crime that carried punishment severe enough to end careers, reputations, sometimes lives. Elian had neither the rank nor the protection to survive such an accusation. Milo whimpered in his arms, and that small sound settled the matter more firmly than any argument could have. He pushed open the gate. The garden at night looked like something from an old dream, silver-edged and quiet, the fountain glowing faintly at its center as if it had been waiting for him. Up close, the water shimmered with a strange clarity, catching the moonlight and holding it, refusing to let the light simply pass through. Elian felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. He knelt at the fountain's edge and eased Nora into the water first, cradling her small body carefully, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. The moment her skin touched the surface, the blue light of the fountain seemed to pulse, gentle and warm, wrapping around her like an embrace. Her breathing, ragged only moments before, began to slow into something calmer. Elian's breath caught in his throat. He watched, disbelieving, as the angry blisters along Nora's arms began to fade, the redness retreating like a tide pulling back from the shore. He lowered Milo in next, his hands trembling now for an entirely different reason. The same warmth spread through the water, the same soft light rising around the pup's small frame. Milo's eyes fluttered open, confused but no longer glassy with fever, and he looked up at Elian with the kind of trust that made Elian's chest ache. For a moment, kneeling there with two healing pups in his arms, Elian allowed himself to feel something close to peace. That peace lasted exactly as long as it took for a shadow to fall across the water beside him. He froze. Someone was standing at the edge of the fountain, tall and still, watching. Elian didn't need to look up to know who it was. Only one presence in this entire kingdom carried that particular weight, that unmistakable authority that pressed against the air itself. The Alpha King had come to the garden, on this night of all nights, and found an Omega bathing forbidden pups in sacred water. Elian's whole body went cold. He had heard stories of what happened to those who defied the old laws, punishments meant to remind the pack why such laws existed in the first place. He thought of his own low standing, his lack of family influence, the fact that no one would speak in his defense if the king decided tonight was the night to make an example. Slowly, because running would accomplish nothing and hiding was impossible, Elian lifted his eyes. The king stood at the fountain's edge, broad-shouldered and unreadable in the moonlight, his expression giving away nothing of what he was thinking. Elian had seen him from a distance countless times during court gatherings, had heard his voice carry across meeting halls with effortless command, but he had never once stood this close, never been looked at quite so directly. For a long, unbearable moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft trickle of the fountain and the pup's quiet, healing breaths. Elian opened his mouth to explain, to beg, to offer any words that might soften what was coming, but the king moved first. He crouched at the water's edge, close enough now that Elian could see the sharp intelligence in his gaze, the way his eyes moved from the pups to Elian and back again, weighing something Elian couldn't guess at. They were sick, Elian managed finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The healer said there was nothing left to try. I know I had no right. I know this ground is not mine to touch. But I could not watch them die when there was still something I might do. The king said nothing. He reached out one hand, not toward Elian, but toward Milo, resting 2 fingers lightly against the pup's forehead, as if testing the truth of what he was seeing. Milo, exhausted and unafraid, simply blinked up at him and yawned. The fever has broken, the king said at last, his voice low, almost thoughtful, as if speaking more to himself than to Elian. Both of them. Yes, Elian said, not knowing what else to offer. The king studied him for a long moment, and Elian felt that gaze like a physical weight, pressing into every part of him that had ever felt unworthy, every corner of himself that had learned to expect judgment before kindness. He braced for the accusation, for the guards who would surely be summoned, for the disgrace that would follow him for whatever remained of his life in this pack. Instead, the king rose to his feet, brushed a hand over his coat, and looked out toward the palace, as though considering something far beyond the garden walls. I came out for air, he said simply. I saw nothing of interest here tonight. Elian stared at him, certain he had misheard. Take the pups back to the nursery, the king continued, his tone even, almost gentle, though something in his eyes suggested this was not a conversation that had truly ended. See that they are warm, and Elian's breath stopped entirely at the sound of his own name, spoken by a king who had never once, in all his years serving this palace, acknowledged that he existed. Be more careful where you are seen next time. With that, the Alpha King turned and walked back toward the palace, his footsteps unhurried, his shadow long across the moonlit grass, leaving Elian kneeling at the edge of the sacred fountain, with 2 healed pups in his arms, and 100 questions he did not dare to ask. He did not move for a long while after the king disappeared from sight. He simply held Milo and Nora close, feeling their steady breathing against his chest, and tried to understand what had just happened. He had broken the oldest law in the kingdom. He had been caught in the act by the one person with the absolute authority to end his life for it. And instead, the king had chosen to see nothing. Elian did not know whether to feel relief or fear. Perhaps, he thought as he finally rose and carried the pups back through the quiet gardens, it was reasonable to feel both. The nursery welcomed them with its familiar warmth, and Elian tucked the pups into their beds, watching their peaceful faces for a long moment before allowing himself to sink into the chair beside them. Outside, the moon continued its slow arc across the sky, indifferent to the secret that now lived between an Omega and his king. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the quiet nursery, listening to the pups breathe easily, for the first time in days, and turned the king's words over and over in his mind. I saw nothing. 4 simple words, and yet Elian understood, even in his exhaustion, that nothing about tonight had been simple at all. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the nursery windows, Elian had reached only one certain conclusion. Whatever had passed between him and the Alpha King beside that fountain, it was far from finished. Some doors, once opened even by accident, do not close again quite so easily. And Elian, meek and overlooked as he had always believed himself to be, had just stepped through one without ever meaning to. The pups slept soundly through the morning, their fevers gone, their small bodies already regaining the color and strength that sickness had stolen from them. Word would spread through the pack by midday that the two youngest pups had somehow recovered overnight, against all expectation, against the healer's own predictions. Elian knew this. He knew that questions would follow, that eyes would begin to search for explanations, and that somewhere in the palace, an Alpha King, who had chosen silence at a fountain's edge, now held the only truth capable of protecting him, or condemning him completely. Elian did not know, as the sun rose fully over the kingdom, and the palace stirred awake around him, which of those two outcomes waited for him in the days ahead. But he understood, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest, that nothing in his quiet, overlooked life would ever be quite the same again. By mid-morning, the palace kitchens were already buzzing with talk of the two pups who had woken laughing and hungry after a night everyone had expected to end in mourning. Elian moved through his usual chores with his head down, scrubbing pots that did not need scrubbing twice, sweeping corridors already swept, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind away from the fountain. It did not work. Every few minutes his thoughts drifted back to the moment the king had knelt beside the water, to the steady weight of his gaze, to those 4 words that had spared him from ruin. I saw nothing. Elian repeated them to himself like a charm, though he could not decide if they were meant to protect him, or simply delay whatever punishment still waited somewhere down the road. Ophelia, the pack's oldest healer, and the closest thing Elian had to a friend within these walls, found him near the washing basins just after midday. She was a stout, sharp-eyed woman who had tended pups and elders alike for longer than Elian had been alive, and she watched him now with the particular suspicion of someone who had raised too many children not to recognize guilt when she saw it. "You look like a wolf who has swallowed a secret too large for his stomach," she said, setting down her basket of herbs. Elian kept his eyes on the basin. "I only slept poorly." Ophelia did not sound convinced. "The pups woke this morning with skin as smooth as the day they were born. No fever, no blisters. Nothing but 2 hungry children demanding breakfast." She studied him a moment longer. "I have tended sickness in this pack for 30 years, Elian. I have never seen a fever like that one break so completely, so quickly, without a single trace left behind." "Perhaps it simply ran its course," Elian offered, though even to his own ears the excuse sounded thin. Ophelia's expression softened, just slightly, the sharpness in her gaze giving way to something closer to concern. "Whatever you did," she said quietly, glancing around to be sure no one else stood within earshot, "I hope you understand what it might cost you, if the wrong ears learn of it." Elian's hands stilled in the water. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you don't." Ophelia picked her basket back up, though she lingered a moment longer, her voice dropping even further. "Just be careful, child. Some kindnesses are dangerous to give in this palace, no matter how much the giving is needed." She left him standing there, with his heart hammering, the warning settling over him like a second layer of cold water. If Ophelia had noticed something was different, others would too. The pack was not blind, and the recovery of 2 dying pups overnight was not the kind of miracle that stayed quiet for long. By evening, whispers had begun moving through the servants' halls in earnest. Some said the pups had simply been stronger than the healer believed. Others murmured about old blessings, about spirits watching over the young, about a dozen harmless explanations that kept the truth safely buried. Elian listened to each version pass by him as he carried trays and folded linens, grateful that none of the guesses landed anywhere close to a moonlit garden and a fountain that was never meant to be touched by hands like his. Then, just as the sun began to set, a guard found him in the corridor outside the nursery and told him, without any explanation, that the Alpha King wished to see him. Elian's stomach dropped so suddenly, he nearly lost his footing. "Now?" he asked, though the guard's expression made clear that the question was pointless. "Now," the guard confirmed, already turning to lead the way. The walk to the king's private study felt longer than any distance Elian had ever crossed within the palace walls. Every step brought fresh waves of dread, each one whispering a different possible outcome. Perhaps the king had reconsidered his silence at the fountain. Perhaps someone else had seen something after all, and the king's mercy from the night before was about to be reversed in the presence of witnesses. Perhaps this was simply the moment. Elian's quiet, unremarkable life came to its quiet, unremarkable end. The guard stopped before a set of heavy wooden doors carved with the crest of the ruling bloodline, knocked once, and opened them without waiting for a reply. Elian stepped inside on legs that did not entirely feel like his own. The king's study was smaller than Elian expected, warmer too, lit by a low fire and a scattering of candles across a broad desk covered in scrolls and papers. The king himself stood near the window, his back to the door, his posture as composed and commanding as it had been beside the fountain the night before. The guard withdrew and closed the doors, leaving Elian alone, with the one person in the kingdom who held the power to end everything he had ever known. For a long moment, the king did not turn around. Elian stood frozen near the entrance, unsure whether he was meant to speak first, to kneel, to simply wait. His pulse thundered in his ears, loud enough that he barely heard the king's voice when it finally came. "How are the pups?" The question was so unexpected that Elian nearly forgot to answer. "They are well, my king, eating, playing, as though nothing ever happened to them at all." The king turned then, and Elian saw something in his expression that he had not expected to find there. Not anger, not the cold calculation of a ruler preparing to deliver judgment. Something closer to curiosity, sharpened by a restlessness Elian could not name. "I have ruled this pack for 11 years, the king said, moving away from the window, closer to where Elian stood. "In that time, I have seen sickness taken by the sacred fountain exactly 3 times, and each time, it was performed by my own hand, using rites passed down through my bloodline for generations. I was taught those waters respond only to blood carrying the mark of the first alphas." Elian's throat tightened. "I do not carry that mark, my king. I know this. I only knew that the pups were dying, and I had heard old stories, and I had nothing left to lose by trying. And yet the waters answered you," the king said, stopping only a few feet away now, close enough that Elian had to fight the instinct to lower his eyes entirely. "Tell me, Elian, who are your parents?" The question struck him harder than any accusation could have. "I do not know, my king. I was found as a pup, left near the eastern border of the territory, taken in by the pack when I was too young to remember anything before that day. I have no family name. No bloodline anyone has ever spoken of." Something shifted behind the king's eyes, a flicker of thought Elian could not decipher. "No one has ever investigated your origins?" "I am an Omega, my king," Elian said quietly, and there was no bitterness in the words, only simple fact. "No one has ever thought my origins worth investigating." The king was silent for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made Elian feel, for the first time in his life, truly seen rather than simply overlooked. It was an unsettling feeling, foreign enough that he did not know what to do with it. "I will not punish you for what happened at the fountain," the king said finally. "You should know that clearly, so you no longer carry the weight of expecting it. But I will ask that you answer my questions honestly, whatever I ask of you from this point forward. Can you agree to that?" Elian hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, my king." "Good." The king returned to his desk, though his gaze lingered on Elian a moment longer, before he gestured toward the door. "Return to the nursery. Watch over the pups tonight, as you always have. We will speak again soon." Elian bowed, murmured his thanks, and left the study on legs, still unsteady from everything that had just passed between them. As he walked back through the quiet palace halls, one thought settled over him with unshakable clarity. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer simply about a fountain, or a broken law, or a king's unexpected mercy. It was about him, about a truth buried somewhere in his forgotten past that even he did not know existed. And for reasons he could not yet understand, the Alpha King seemed determined to uncover it, one careful question at a time. Elian reached the nursery just as the last light faded from the sky, and standing there in the doorway, watching Milo and Nora sleep peacefully in their beds. He felt something new stir beneath his fear. Not quite hope, not quite certainty. Something closer to the feeling of standing at the very beginning of a story, whose ending he could not yet imagine. 3 days passed before the king summoned Elian again, and in that time, the palace seemed to hold its breath around him. He felt eyes on him in the corridors that had never bothered to notice him before, felt whispers trail behind him that he could not quite catch the shape of. Nothing had been said openly, no accusation had been made. And yet something in the air had shifted, subtle but undeniable, the way weather changes before a storm arrives. Ophelia continued to watch him with quiet concern, though she never pressed him further for answers he could not give. The pups, oblivious to everything except their own restored health, had taken to following Elian everywhere, tugging at his sleeves, demanding stories before bed, treating him with the easy trust of children who had no reason yet to understand the danger their rescuer had walked into on their behalf. It was Garrick, one of the higher-ranked wolves who served among the king's personal guard, who first said something to Elian's face. He cornered him near the training yard on the third evening, his arms crossed, his expression carrying the particular condescension that Elian had grown used to from wolves of his rank. "The king has called for you twice this week," Garrick said, his tone deceptively light, though his eyes carried something sharper beneath the surface. "That is unusual, wouldn't you say, for an Omega with no name, no family, no rank worth mentioning?" Elian kept his gaze steady, though his heart beat faster. "I only know that he has asked to speak with me. I do not question his reasons." "No," Garrick said, stepping closer. "I imagine you wouldn't." He studied Elian for a long moment, the way a wolf studies something it has not yet decided whether to trust or to challenge. Strange, though. The pups recovering so suddenly, right around the same time the king begins taking a personal interest in someone who has spent years cleaning floors and carrying firewood. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? The question landed with more precision than Elian liked. He forced his expression to remain calm, though every instinct screamed at him to look away, to flee, to do anything except stand here and be studied like prey caught in the open. "I only care for the pups because someone must," Elian said quietly. "Whatever the king wishes to discuss with me is his own business, not mine to explain to anyone else." Garrick's eyes narrowed slightly, but before he could press further, a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Is there a problem here?" Elian turned to find the king himself standing at the edge of the training yard, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every wolf nearby. Garrick straightened at once, his earlier confidence folding into the practiced deference every subordinate owed their ruler. "No problem, my king," Garrick said quickly. "Merely a conversation." "Then I trust it has concluded," the king said, his tone even, but carrying an edge that left no room for argument. Garrick bowed and retreated without another word, casting one last unreadable glance toward Elian, before disappearing toward the barracks. The king watched him go, then turned his attention to Elian, studying him with the same quiet intensity Elian was slowly growing accustomed to, though it still made his pulse quicken every time. "Walk with me," the king said, and it was not quite a command, though Elian understood it carried the same weight as one. They walked together through the palace gardens as the last light of evening settled over the grounds, the same gardens that held the sacred fountain at their center, though the king led them along a different path this time, further from the water Elian had trespassed upon only days before. "Garrick suspects something," the king said after a long silence, not as a question, but as a simple observation. "I believe he does," Elian admitted, seeing no benefit in denying what had clearly been obvious to them both. "He is not wrong to suspect it," the king continued, though he does not yet understand what it is he suspects. He glanced sideways at Elian, something almost amused flickering across his features before settling back into thoughtful seriousness. "I have spent these past days looking into the records kept from the time you were found near the eastern border. There is very little written down. A pup, found alone. No markings, no belongings. Brought into the pack out of simple mercy rather than any obligation." Elian's chest tightened. "I have always known as much." "What you may not know," the king said, "is that the eastern border sits along territory that once belonged to a bloodline nearly lost to history. A line of Omegas, said to carry a rare gift, tied closely to the old healing rites, long before my own bloodline claimed dominion over the sacred fountain. The stories say their touch alone could call the waters to answer, without any ritual, without any ceremony, simply through the purity of their intention. Elian stopped walking entirely, staring at the king as the weight of what he was suggesting settled over him. "You believe I might be descended from such a line?" "I believe," the king said carefully, "that the fountain does not respond to just anyone claiming desperation and good intention. There is a reason it answered you, and a reason it has never answered anyone outside my own bloodline in living memory. I intend to find that reason, Elian, whatever it costs to uncover it." The admission left Elian reeling, though beneath the shock, something else began to stir. For his entire life, he had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that his origins did not matter, that he was simply a pup, taken in, out of kindness, with no history worth exploring. To hear now that his blood might carry a legacy older than the ruling family itself was almost too much to process standing in the quiet dusk of the palace gardens. "Why does this matter to you?" Elian asked finally, the question slipping free before he could stop it. "My king, forgive me, but you are the ruler of this entire pack. Surely there are matters of far greater importance than the ancestry of one Omega." The king was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the darkening sky, something unreadable passing behind his expression. "Perhaps," he said eventually, "though I find myself unable to stop thinking about it regardless." He looked back at Elian then, and there was something in his eyes that made Elian's breath catch, something that went beyond simple curiosity about bloodlines and old legends. "There are very few things in this palace that surprise me anymore, Elian. You have managed it twice in the same week." Before Elian could find any response to that, a young messenger came running through the garden path, breathless and urgent, bowing quickly before delivering his news. "My king, forgive the interruption. There is a matter at the northern gate requiring your immediate attention, a dispute among the border patrols." The king's expression shifted instantly into something harder, more composed, the ruler reasserting himself over whatever quieter moment had just passed between them. "I will attend to it at once." He turned back to Elian, his voice returning to its familiar measured tone, though something softer lingered just beneath it. "We will continue this conversation soon. In the meantime, say nothing of what we have discussed, to anyone, including Ophelia. Not until I understand more fully what we are dealing with." "Yes, my king," Elian said quietly, watching him turn and stride away toward the northern gate, his authority settling back over him like a familiar cloak. Elian remained alone in the garden for a long while after, staring out at the darkening grounds, turning the king's words over in his mind, again and again. A bloodline of rare Omegas, a legacy tied to the very fountain that had saved Milo and Nora's lives. A king who seemed, against every expectation Elian had ever held about his own place in this world, genuinely determined to understand him rather than dismiss him. For the first time since the night at the fountain, Elian allowed himself to wonder if perhaps his life was not as small and unremarkable as he had always believed it to be. The thought frightened him nearly as much as it stirred something warm and unfamiliar in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. He made his way back toward the nursery, beneath a sky now full of stars, unaware that Garrick still stood watching from the shadows of the training yard, his suspicion sharpening into something far more dangerous than simple curiosity. Garrick did not sleep well that night. He lay awake in the barracks turning over everything he had witnessed in the garden. The king's uncharacteristic patience toward an Omega of no standing, the strange tension that had passed between them, the way the king had dismissed him so swiftly, as though protecting a conversation he did not want overheard. Garrick had served in the king's guard for 6 years, had watched him handle disputes, wars, and treaties with unshakable composure. He had never once seen him behave the way he had behaved tonight. By morning, Garrick had convinced himself that something was deeply wrong, and that it was his duty, as a loyal member of the guard, to uncover exactly what that something was. He began quietly, asking careful questions among the kitchen staff about the pup's sudden recovery, listening closely to the servants' gossip he had previously dismissed as beneath his attention. He learned that Elian had been the one caring for the pups through the worst of their illness. He learned that Elian had vanished from his usual duties the same night the pup's fever miraculously broke. He learned, from a nervous young stable hand who had been awake far too late that night tending to a restless horse, that a figure matching Elian's description had been seen slipping toward the palace gardens sometime after midnight, carrying 2 small bundles. Garrick said nothing of what he learned to anyone, He simply gathered each piece carefully, like a wolf assembling the pieces of a hunt, waiting for the moment the full picture would reveal itself. Meanwhile, Elian returned to his duties with a strange new awareness settling over him. He performed his usual tasks, tended the pups, moved through the palace as he always had, and yet everything felt subtly different now, colored by the knowledge the king had shared with him in the garden. He found himself watching the sacred fountain from a distance, whenever his chores carried him near the gardens, wondering about the old bloodline the king had described, wondering if some forgotten piece of himself truly connected back to it. Ophelia noticed the shift in him almost immediately. Though true to her word, she did not press him for details he clearly was not ready to share. Instead, she simply began finding small ways to ease his burdens, assigning him lighter duties, sending him extra portions at mealtimes, watching over him with the quiet protectiveness of someone who suspected far more than she let on. 3 days after their conversation in the garden, the king summoned Elian once more, this time not to his study, but to a private section of the palace library that few outside the ruling family were permitted to enter. Elian arrived to find him seated at a long table, covered in old scrolls and leather-bound records, dust rising faintly in the candlelight, as the king carefully turned brittle pages. "Come," the king said without looking up, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I have found something you should see." Elian approached cautiously, still unaccustomed to being invited to sit in the king's presence, still half expecting each of these meetings to end in some revelation of danger he had not anticipated. He lowered himself into the chair and watched as the king slid one particular scroll toward him, its edges worn soft with age. "This record dates back nearly 2 centuries, the king explained, "written during the reign of my ancestor, the 4th Alpha King of this territory. It describes a bloodline of Omegas living along the eastern border, gifted with what the old texts call the healer's mark. According to this account, their touch alone could call upon sacred waters to mend even the gravest wounds, without ceremony, without bloodline claim to the ruling family. The record states that this gift was considered so powerful, so potentially disruptive to the established order, that the bloodline was eventually scattered, its descendants dispersed across the territory, to prevent any single family from holding such influence." Elian stared down at the faded script, tracing the unfamiliar words with his eyes, though he could not read the old script fluently. "You believe I descend from this bloodline. I believe it is possible," the king said carefully. "The timing of your discovery near the eastern border, the nature of what happened at the fountain, the fact that the waters responded to you at all despite carrying none of my own bloodline's mark. It fits a pattern too precise to dismiss as coincidence." Elian sat with this for a long moment, feeling something shift inside his chest, some old ache he had carried since childhood, without ever fully understanding its shape. He had always believed himself unwanted, discarded, a pup left behind, simply because no one cared enough to keep him. To hear now that perhaps his origins carried purpose rather than mere abandonment felt almost too tender a thought to hold. "If this is true," Elian said slowly, "what does it mean for me now?" The king's expression grew more serious. "It means, if word of this spreads before I understand it fully myself, there may be those within this pack, and beyond it, who would seek to use you for what you carry, rather than value you for who you are. The old bloodline was scattered for a reason, Elian. Power such as this makes people afraid, and fear breeds actions I would rather protect you from." The warmth Elian had felt only moments before cooled slightly beneath the weight of this new concern. Then perhaps it would be safer for everyone if this remained buried. "I have no wish to bring danger to the pack, or to the pups, or to anyone else within these walls." "That is not your decision to make alone," the king said, his voice gentler now than Elian had ever heard it. "Nor is it mine. But I intend to see that whatever comes of this, you are protected through it. That much I can promise you." Elian looked up at him, searching his face for any sign that this promise was simply another obligation of rulership, another duty owed to a subject under his protection. What he found instead was something far more personal, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he did not yet have the courage to name. "Why do you care so much for my protection?" Elian asked quietly. "I am no one of importance to you, my king. Not truly, not beyond whatever curiosity my bloodline has stirred in you." The king was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Perhaps that was true when this began," he admitted finally. "It is no longer true now." The words settled over Elian like warmth spreading through cold water, and he found himself unable to look away from the king's steady gaze, caught in a moment that felt far too significant for two people of such different standing to be sharing at all. Before either of them could say more, a sharp knock interrupted the quiet of the library, and a guard entered, bowing quickly, his expression tight with urgency. "My king, forgive me. Garrick has requested an audience. He says the matter cannot wait." The king's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though he nodded, rising from his seat and gathering the old scroll carefully back into its protective case. "Return to the nursery, Elian. We will speak again." Elian rose as well, though something in the guard's tense expression left an uneasy weight settling in his stomach. He bowed and made his way from the library, casting one last glance back toward the king, before the heavy doors closed between them. Outside, in the corridor beyond, Garrick stood waiting, his posture rigid, his expression carrying a grim determination that Elian did not understand until much later. As their eyes met briefly in passing, Garrick said nothing, offered no acknowledgement at all beyond a cold, measuring stare that followed Elian long after he had turned the corner and disappeared from sight. Whatever Garrick intended to bring before the king that evening, Elian understood, with a growing sense of dread, that it would not be good news for either of them. Garrick stood before the king with his shoulders squared and his voice carefully controlled, though beneath the discipline of years spent serving in the royal guard, something restless and uncertain flickered in his eyes. He had rehearsed this moment on his walk to the library, had told himself repeatedly that he was acting out of loyalty, out of duty, to protect the sanctity of the old laws. Yet standing now before the king's steady, unreadable gaze, his certainty wavered more than he expected. "Speak," the king said simply, settling into the chair behind his desk, his tone giving away nothing of the conversation he had just left behind in the library. "My king," Garrick began, "I have reason to believe the pup's recovery was not the miracle the pack has assumed it to be. I believe the sacred fountain was used without proper rite, by someone outside the bloodline entitled to its waters." The king's expression did not change, though something in the stillness of his posture told Garrick he had struck closer to the truth than the king wished to openly admit. "That is a serious accusation," the king said evenly. "Do you have proof to support it?" "I have witnesses who saw Elian near the gardens the night the pups recovered," Garrick said. "I have the timing of events that cannot easily be explained away as coincidence. I have my own judgment, sharpened by years of service to this pack, telling me that something has been hidden from the rest of us." "Judgment is not proof," the king said, though his voice carried a weight of caution now that had not been there a moment before. "With respect, my king," Garrick pressed, "the old laws exist precisely because the waters carry power too great to be handled carelessly. If an Omega with no bloodline claim has found some way to access that power, the pack deserves to know. For its own protection, if nothing else." The king studied him for a long moment, and Garrick forced himself to hold that gaze, though every instinct urged him to look away beneath its weight. "And what would you have me do, Garrick? Punish an Omega for saving the lives of two dying pups?" "I would have you investigate the matter properly," Garrick said, rather than allow whispers and unanswered questions to spread through the pack unchecked. "Already the servants speak of miracles and blessings. If the truth is stranger than that, my king, would you not rather control how it is understood, before someone less loyal than myself uncovers it and uses it against you?" The words landed with more precision than Garrick perhaps intended, and the king's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack Garrick had seen in his composure since the conversation began. It was enough to tell Garrick that his instincts had not misled him, that there was indeed more happening here than the king wished to reveal. "You raise a fair concern," the king admitted finally, though his tone remained guarded. "I will address this matter in my own time and my own manner. Until then, I expect your discretion, Garrick. This is not a rumor to be spread carelessly through the ranks." "Of course, my king," Garrick said, bowing, though as he straightened, something in his eyes suggested his discretion came with limits he had not yet fully defined for himself. He left the library with more questions than he had arrived with, and beneath his loyalty to the pack's old laws, a new and uncomfortable thought had begun to take root. The king was protecting Elian, not simply overlooking an act of desperation born from a servant's love for two sick pups, but actively shielding him, investigating alongside him, treating him with a level of personal attention Garrick had never once seen extended to anyone outside the ruling family. Whatever the reason, Garrick intended to understand it fully before he decided what, if anything, to do about it. Elian, unaware of the precise nature of Garrick's suspicions, spent the following days caught between the quiet wonder the king's revelations had stirred in him, and a growing unease he could not fully name. He noticed Garrick watching him more closely now, catching his eye across the training yard, lingering near the nursery corridors at hours that seemed too deliberate to be coincidence. He said nothing of it to Ophelia, honoring the king's request for discretion, even as the weight of the secret grew heavier with each passing day. The pups, blissfully unaware of the tension building around them, continued to thrive, their recovery complete, their energy returned in full. Milo had taken to following Elian everywhere, with an especially fierce devotion, tugging at his sleeve during every spare moment to demand another story or another game. Nora, quieter by nature, had taken instead to sitting close beside him during quiet hours, resting her small head against his arm, as though she understood, in whatever way pups understood such things, that Elian had given her something precious that she could not yet put into words. It was during one such quiet afternoon, with Nora dozing against his side and Milo chasing a wooden toy across the nursery floor, that the king appeared unannounced in the doorway, watching the scene for a long moment before Elian noticed his presence. "My king," Elian said quickly, moving to rise, though the king raised a hand to stop him. "Stay," the king said, his voice softer than Elian had ever heard it in front of others. He stepped into the nursery, his gaze moving over the pups with an expression Elian could not quite decipher, something between fondness and old, careful distance, as though he had trained himself long ago not to grow too attached to such simple domestic warmth. "They are well," Elian said, glancing down at Nora's sleeping face. "I can see that," the king replied, lowering himself into the chair across from Elian, with none of the formal stiffness Elian had grown accustomed to seeing in the throne room or his private study. Here, surrounded by pups and soft candlelight, something in him seemed to ease, if only slightly. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the king watching Milo's clumsy attempts to stack wooden blocks into a tower that inevitably collapsed each time, a small, genuine smile touching his features that Elian suspected very few people in this palace had ever been permitted to witness. "Garrick came to me," the king said eventually, his voice quiet enough not to disturb the pups. "He suspects what happened at the fountain. I do not yet know how far his suspicions have spread, or what he intends to do with them." Elian's chest tightened, the fragile peace of the afternoon giving way to renewed worry. What will happen if others learn the truth? "I do not know," the king admitted, and there was an honesty in his voice that Elian found both comforting and unsettling in equal measure. "But I intend to see that whatever comes, you are not left to face it alone." Elian looked at him then, searching his face in the soft candlelight, and found himself once again caught in that same charged stillness that had passed between them in the library days before. Something was shifting between them, slow and quiet and undeniable, something Elian did not yet have the courage to name, though he suspected the king felt it just as clearly as he did. Milo's tower collapsed again with a small clatter, breaking the moment, and the pup let out a delighted laugh that pulled both of them back into the simple warmth of the present. The king reached down, without seeming to think about it, and helped steady the next block Milo attempted to stack, earning a triumphant giggle from the pup that eased some of the tension still lingering in the room. Watching him there, kneeling on the nursery floor beside a pup he had every right to ignore, Elian understood with sudden clarity that whatever was growing between them, it was no longer simply about bloodlines, or sacred waters, or old forgotten legacies. It had become something far more personal than either of them had likely intended, and far more dangerous, given everything else now stirring quietly beneath the surface of the palace around them. Word of Garrick's suspicions did not stay contained for long, despite the king's warning. Within a week, quiet murmurs had begun circulating among the higher-ranked wolves, careful and indirect at first, questions dressed up as idle curiosity about the pup's sudden recovery, about the amount of time the king had begun spending with an omega no one had previously thought worth noticing. Elian felt the shift everywhere he went, in the way conversations paused when he entered a room, in the sidelong glances that followed him through the corridors, in the careful, deliberate distance some of the staff now kept from him, as though uncertain whether associating with him too closely might prove unwise. Only Ophelia remained unchanged, her warmth toward him steady, despite the growing tension elsewhere in the palace. She said nothing directly about the whispers, though Elian suspected she heard every version of them circulating through the kitchens and washing rooms. Instead, she simply continued finding small ways to support him. A warm meal left quietly at his door, an extra blanket for the nursery on cold nights, a steady presence whenever the weight of everything else grew too heavy to carry alone. "You needn't tell me anything," she said to him one evening, as they sat together folding linens in the quiet after the pups had been put to bed. "But I want you to know, whatever is happening, I do not believe for a moment that you have done anything to be ashamed of." Elian looked up at her, grateful beyond words for the simple kindness of her trust. "Thank you, Ophelia. I only wish I understood myself what is happening well enough to explain it to you." She smiled gently, patting his hand. "Some things reveal themselves in their own time, child. Trust that the king knows what he is doing. He is not a man who acts carelessly, whatever else the pack may whisper about him." Her words offered Elian a measure of comfort, though the unease did not fully leave him. He continued his duties as always, caring for the pups, performing his chores, watching the palace around him grow more tense with each passing day, as the whispers refused to quiet. The king, for his part, seemed to grow more determined, rather than more cautious, as the pressure mounted. He summoned Elian to the library again several days later, this time with a small collection of additional records spread across the table, along with something else Elian had not expected to find waiting for him there. A woman sat beside the king, elderly and sharp-eyed, dressed in simple traveling clothes that marked her as someone from beyond the palace walls. She studied Elian with an intensity that made him distinctly uncomfortable, though there was no hostility in her gaze, only careful, searching curiosity. "This is Ren," the king explained, gesturing to the woman. "A healer from the Eastern Territories, one of the last remaining keepers of knowledge regarding the old bloodline we discussed. I sent for her the moment I began to suspect the truth of your origins." Ren rose slowly, approaching Elian, with the deliberate care of someone examining something precious and fragile. She reached out, taking his hand in both of hers, turning it over gently, to study his palm, his fingers, the faint lines etched into his skin, that Elian had never once thought to examine closely himself. "Yes," Ren murmured after a long moment, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that sent a shiver down Elian's spine. "I see it now. The mark is faint, hidden beneath years of neglect and disuse, but it is there. You carry the blood of the healer's child. There is no doubt in my mind." Elian's breath caught, the weight of her words settling over him with a strange mixture of validation and fear. "What does this mean? What am I meant to do with this?" "It means," Ren said, releasing his hand and studying him with something close to reverence, "that you carry a gift few in this world remember still exists. The old healers were not simply able to call upon sacred waters, child. In time, with proper guidance, that gift can grow far beyond a single fountain. It becomes something carried within you, something that can be called upon wherever it is needed most." The revelation left Elian reeling, and he glanced toward the king, searching his expression for some sign of how to process what he had just learned. The king's face carried a careful mixture of vindication and concern, as though this confirmation answered one set of questions, while opening an entirely new set of dangers he had not yet fully considered. "If this becomes widely known," the king said slowly, addressing Ren directly now, "what dangers does Elian face?" Ren's expression grew grave. "Many, my king. There are those beyond this territory who would seek to control such a gift, to claim it for their own purposes, rather than allow it to remain freely given. The old bloodline was scattered for good reason, generations ago. If word spreads that a true healer walks again within these walls, you will need to protect him carefully, and swiftly, before others arrive with intentions far less noble than your own." The warning settled heavily over the room, and Elian felt the full weight of everything shifting around him, the quiet, unremarkable life he had always known dissolving further with each new revelation. He was no longer simply an overlooked Omega who had broken an old law out of desperate love for two sick pups. He was, apparently, the last living carrier of a legacy that could draw danger from beyond the very borders of the kingdom itself. "I did not ask for this," Elian said quietly, more to himself than to either of them, though the king heard him clearly enough to respond. No, the king agreed, his voice softening as he stepped closer. But you have it regardless. And I intend to see that whatever comes with it, you are protected through every part of it. Ren studied the exchange between them with quiet, knowing interest, though she said nothing further on the matter, gathering her things instead, and preparing to take her leave. I will remain nearby for a time, she said, in case my knowledge proves useful as this unfolds. But I caution you both, time is not on your side. Word travels quickly, even within palace walls thought secure. She departed with a final, lingering glance toward Elian, leaving him alone with the king once more, amid the scattered scrolls and flickering candlelight of the library. I did not expect any of this, Elian admitted quietly, sinking into the chair across from the king's desk, the weight of the day settling heavily over him. Nor did I, the king said, though something in his voice carried less alarm and more quiet determination than Elian expected. He moved around the desk, closer to where Elian sat, and knelt slightly to meet his eyes directly. But I meant what I told you before, Elian. Whatever comes of this, you will not face it alone. I will not allow it. Elian looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of doubt, and found none. Only steady, unwavering resolve, and something warmer beneath it, that Elian was beginning, slowly and carefully, to allow himself to trust. Outside the library windows, the palace continued its quiet evening routines, unaware that within these walls, an old legacy long thought lost had begun stirring back to life, carrying with it both the promise of healing and the shadow of danger neither Elian nor the king could yet fully predict. The warning Ren left behind proved accurate sooner than either Elian or the king had hoped. Less than a week later, a messenger arrived at the palace gates bearing the colors of a neighboring territory, requesting urgent audience with the Alpha King on a matter the messenger refused to disclose to anyone beneath the ruling family's direct attention. Elian learned of the visit secondhand, through the nervous chatter of kitchen staff preparing refreshments for an unexpected guest of importance. He felt an uneasy tightening in his chest, even before Ophelia found him later that afternoon, her expression grave in a way he had rarely seen from her. The visitor is Lord Edmund, an advisor from the Northern Territories, she told him quietly, pulling him aside into an empty corridor. Word travels fast in courts like these, Elian, faster and further than any of us would wish. There are already whispers reaching beyond our borders about a healer walking again among the Omega ranks. Elian's stomach dropped. How is that possible? We have been so careful. Careful is not the same as invisible, Ophelia said gently, though there was real worry beneath her calm exterior. Servants talk, guards talk. Even careful secrets have a way of slipping through cracks none of us think to guard. The news left Elian shaken for the remainder of the day, and it was with considerable dread that he received word, that evening, that the king wished to see him immediately, in his private chambers, away from the more public setting of the study or library. He arrived to find the king pacing, a tension in his movements that Elian had never witnessed before, not even during the earlier moments of uncertainty surrounding Garrick's suspicions. The king turned as Elian entered, and the look on his face confirmed everything Ophelia had already told him. Lord Edmund has come seeking confirmation of rumors reaching the northern courts, the king said without preamble. Rumors of a healer, bearing the old mark, discovered within my own pack. I have denied any knowledge of such a person, but he is not a man easily satisfied by simple denials. What does he want? Elian asked, though he suspected he already understood the answer. What every ambitious lord wants when he hears whispers of power, he does not currently control, the king said grimly. He wishes to see this healer for himself, to determine whether such a gift might be persuaded, purchased, or claimed for use elsewhere. The words settled over Elian like ice water. You mean he wishes to take me? I mean, the king said, stopping his pacing to face Elian directly, that I do not intend to allow that to happen, under any circumstance. But I need you to understand the seriousness of what we are facing now. This is no longer contained to whispers within our own walls. Elian felt his pulse racing, old fears resurfacing with fresh urgency. He had spent his entire life believing himself too insignificant for anyone to notice, let alone pursue. The idea that his very existence might now draw the ambitions of lords from distant territories felt almost impossible to fully comprehend. What would you have me do? He asked quietly. The king's expression softened slightly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. For now, remain close to the nursery, close to Ophelia, close to those you trust. I will handle Lord Edmund myself. But Elian? He hesitated, something vulnerable flickering briefly across his usually composed features. I need you to trust that I will not let anyone take you from this pack. Whatever it costs me to ensure that, I will pay it. The intensity behind his words left Elian momentarily breathless, caught once again in that charged stillness that had grown increasingly familiar between them over these past weeks. He wanted, desperately, to believe every word of that promise, though the fear coursing through him made trust difficult to hold on to fully. Why does my safety matter so much to you? Elian asked, the question slipping free before he could stop himself, echoing one he had asked before in the garden, though this time he needed a fuller answer than the king had given him then. The king was quiet for a long moment, studying Elian with an expression that seemed to war between careful restraint and something far less guarded, because somewhere between that first night at the fountain and now, he said finally, his voice low and unusually unsteady, you have become far more important to me than I ever expected, or intended, to allow. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them had yet fully acknowledged aloud. Elian felt his heart racing, for reasons that had nothing to do with fear now, caught in the steady warmth of the king's gaze, unable to look away even as every instinct told him such a moment was far too dangerous to indulge. Before either of them could say more, a sharp knock interrupted the silence, and a guard entered to announce that Lord Edmund requested an audience within the hour. The king's expression shifted immediately back into careful composure, the ruler reasserting himself over whatever fragile moment had just passed between them. Stay hidden until I send word, the king instructed Elian firmly. Trust no one beyond Ophelia in the meantime. I will deal with Lord Edmund, and I will make certain he leaves this pack with nothing but empty rumors to carry back north. Elian nodded, though his heart still pounded with everything left unresolved between them. Everything he had just heard the king admit aloud for the very first time. He retreated to the nursery as instructed, finding Ophelia already waiting there, her expression grim with concern, as she ushered him inside and secured the door behind them. Whatever happens tonight, she said quietly, settling beside him as the pup slept peacefully nearby, know that you are not without allies in this palace, Elian. More than you likely realize. Elian nodded, grateful for her steady presence, though his thoughts remained fixed on the king, somewhere within these walls now facing down a rival lord's ambition, with nothing but his own authority, and whatever careful diplomacy he could summon to protect a secret that had already begun slipping beyond their control. The night stretched on tensely, every sound in the corridor outside pulling Elian's attention toward the door, every passing hour deepening the uncertainty of what awaited him once the king's meeting with Lord Edmund finally concluded. He did not know, sitting there in the quiet nursery with Ophelia beside him and the pup sleeping soundly nearby, whether the coming morning would bring relief or renewed danger. But he understood, with growing certainty, that whatever happened next, his fate and the king's had become tangled together in ways neither of them could easily unwind, regardless of how this particular threat resolved itself. The meeting between the king and Lord Edmund stretched long into the night, and Elian learned only fragments of what transpired within those private chambers, pieced together the following morning, through careful conversation with the king himself. Lord Edmund, it seemed, had come prepared with pointed questions and thinly veiled offers, suggesting that any healer discovered within the pack might be better served and better compensated under the protection of a larger and more influential territory. The king had denied every implication with practiced diplomacy, insisting that the rumors reaching the northern courts were nothing more than exaggerated gossip born from the pup's fortunate recovery from what had likely been an ordinary illness. Lord Edmund, though visibly skeptical, had ultimately departed at dawn without further incident, though not without a final warning that he intended to keep watching the pack's affairs closely in the months ahead. He did not believe me, the king admitted to Elian later that morning, exhaustion evident in the tightness around his eyes. But he had no proof to press the matter further, and for now, that will have to be enough. For now, Elian repeated quietly, understanding the temporary nature of the reprieve all too well. The following days brought a fragile, uneasy calm to the palace. Garrick's suspicions, though never fully confirmed, seemed to quiet somewhat under the king's careful handling, and the wider whispers among the staff gradually settled back into the ordinary rhythms of palace life. Elian resumed his duties, cautious but steadier now, comforted by Ophelia's continued support and the growing, undeniable warmth that had settled between himself and the king with each passing conversation. It was during a quiet afternoon, nearly 2 weeks later, as Elian tended the garden near the edge of the sacred fountain, under the king's personal invitation this time, that the true weight of everything shifted between them once more. "I have thought a great deal," the king said, watching Elian carefully tend a small cluster of flowering herbs near the fountain's edge, "about what Ren told us regarding your gift, about what it might mean, not only for your own safety, but for the well-being of this entire pack, if nurtured properly, rather than hidden away out of fear." Elian looked up at him, brushing dirt from his hands. "What are you suggesting, my king?" "I am suggesting," the king said, moving closer, "that rather than continuing to conceal what you are, perhaps it is time to consider embracing it, carefully and deliberately, under my full protection, rather than in secret. A recognized healer, honored rather than hidden, would be far more difficult for lords like Edmund to threaten or claim than a frightened Omega with no standing at all." The proposal left Elian momentarily speechless, the implications settling over him slowly. "You would elevate me publicly? Reveal what happened at the fountain, despite everything we have worked to keep contained?" "Not recklessly," the king clarified, "but yes, in time, carefully managed and on our own terms, rather than allowing rumor and ambition from beyond our borders to define the narrative for us. I believe it would protect you far better than continued secrecy ever could." Elian considered this carefully, weighing the fear of exposure against the exhaustion of constantly living beneath the shadow of discovery. "And what of my standing within the pack itself? I have spent my whole life as the lowest among the ranks here. I do not know how to imagine myself as anything else." The king stepped closer still, close enough now that Elian had to tilt his head slightly to meet his gaze. "Then allow me to help you imagine it," he said quietly, something warm and unguarded settling into his expression. "You are not the lowest among any rank I recognize, Elian. You have not been for some time now, whatever titles this pack has assigned you." The words, spoken so plainly, and with such quiet conviction, left Elian's heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear at all. He searched the king's face, finding nothing but steady sincerity there, and felt something long guarded within himself begin, cautiously, to loosen. "You confuse me," Elian admitted softly. "One moment you speak as my king, protecting a secret that endangers your entire rule. The next, you speak as though—" He stopped himself, uncertain how to finish the thought, though the king finished it for him. "As though I care for you as far more than simply a subject under my protection?" The king asked quietly, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, only quiet honesty laid bare. "Because I do, Elian. I have tried, more than once, to convince myself this was simply curiosity, simply duty towards someone caught in circumstances beyond their control. I no longer believe that is the whole truth of it." The confession settled between them in the quiet garden air, and Elian felt the weight of it pressing gently against every guarded corner of his heart. He had spent his entire life expecting so little, believing himself unworthy of notice, let alone the genuine affection of the very king who ruled over everything and everyone Elian had ever known. "I do not know what to say," Elian admitted honestly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need not say anything yet," the king said gently, reaching out to brush a stray strand of hair from Elian's face, with a tenderness that made Elian's breath catch entirely. "I only wanted you to understand the truth of it, whatever you choose to do with that understanding." They stood together beside the sacred fountain, in comfortable, charged silence, the same waters that had once nearly cost Elian everything, now bearing quiet witness to something entirely different unfolding between them. Elian did not know, in that moment, what the coming days would bring, whether Lord Edmund's ambitions would resurface, whether Garrick's suspicions would ever be fully laid to rest, or whether the pack itself would accept an Omega, elevated so suddenly and so dramatically from the lowest ranks to something far greater. But standing there, beside the king who had chosen, again and again, to protect him rather than condemn him, Elian felt something steady and hopeful settle over him, a feeling he had rarely allowed himself to trust before now. Perhaps, he thought, watching the fountain's gentle waters catch the afternoon light, some stories did not have to end the way fear always warned they might. Perhaps some quiet, overlooked lives held far more possibility than anyone, including the ones living them, had ever dared to imagine. The peace that had settled over the palace gardens did not last long. Barely 3 days after the king's quiet confession beside the fountain, word arrived that Lord Edmund had returned, this time accompanied by a small retinue and a formal request for an official audience before the entire court, rather than the private meeting he had been granted before. Elian felt the tension return to the palace instantly, the fragile calm of recent days collapsing beneath the weight of renewed uncertainty. Ophelia found him in the nursery that morning, her expression grave as she relayed what she had overheard among the guards stationed near the main hall. He claims to have gathered further evidence, she told Elian quietly, glancing toward the sleeping pups to ensure they remained undisturbed by the tension in her voice. Evidence he intends to present before the full court this time, rather than simply raising private suspicion with the king alone. Elian's stomach twisted with dread. What kind of evidence could he possibly have found? I do not know, Ophelia admitted, but Garrick was seen speaking with members of Lord Edmund's retinue late last night. I fear his suspicions may have found a willing audience beyond our own walls. The implication struck Elian hard. If Garrick had indeed shared what he knew, or suspected, with Lord Edmund's people, then whatever careful protection the king had tried to build around him these past weeks might now be unraveling entirely, publicly, before the very court that held the power to decide his fate. He found the king preparing for the audience later that afternoon, his expression composed but carrying an unmistakable tension beneath the surface. He looked up as Elian entered, and something in his gaze softened briefly before hardening back into the careful authority he would need to carry into the court hall ahead. Whatever is said today, the king told him firmly, I need you to trust me. Do not speak unless directly addressed. Do not confirm or deny anything without my guidance. Can you do that? Elian nodded, though fear still coiled tightly in his chest. I trust you. The court hall, when they entered together a short while later, was fuller than Elian had ever seen it. Nobles and guards and staff alike gathered to witness whatever confrontation Lord Edmund intended to bring before the king's full authority. Elian stood near the edge of the gathering, doing his best to remain unnoticed despite the curious glances already drifting his way. Lord Edmund stood at the center of the hall when the king took his place upon the raised dais, his expression carrying the confident smugness of a man who believed he already held the winning position in whatever game he intended to play. My king, Edmund began, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. I come before your court today not to accuse, but simply to seek the truth. Rumors have reached my territory of a healer discovered within your pack, one capable of calling upon the power of your sacred fountain without the bloodline claim your ancestors long protected. I have brought witnesses prepared to testify to what they have seen and heard. He gestured, and to Elian's horror, Garrick himself stepped forward from among Lord Edmund's retinue, his expression carefully neutral, though guilt flickered briefly across his features as his eyes met Elian's across the crowded hall. Garrick, the king said, his voice carrying a warning edge that silenced any murmuring that had begun rippling through the gathered court. You would testify against your own pack, before a foreign lord, rather than bring your concerns to me directly? I brought my concerns to you directly, my king, Garrick said, though his voice wavered slightly under the weight of the king's cold displeasure. You dismissed them. I believed the truth deserved a fuller hearing than you were willing to grant it. The betrayal stung visibly across the king's expression, before he composed himself once more, turning back to address Lord Edmund and the full court with careful authority. Very well. If the truth is what this court desires, then the truth is what I will give it. Elian's heart pounded as the king's gaze found his across the hall, something steady and reassuring passing silently between them, despite the danger of the moment. The king straightened, addressing the gathered court with unwavering resolve. It is true, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, that an omega within this pack discovered, through desperate love for 2 dying pups, an old and forgotten gift, tied to a bloodline long thought lost. It is true that the sacred fountain answered him, though he carries none of my own bloodline's claim to its waters. And it is true that I chose, that night, to protect him rather than condemn him, because the old laws of this pack were never meant to punish mercy freely given, in the name of saving innocent lives. A ripple of stunned murmuring passed through the court, though the king continued before it could grow into anything louder. "I do not apologize for that choice," he said firmly, "nor will I allow this Omega to be claimed, threatened, or removed from this pack by any outside lord seeking to exploit a gift meant for healing rather than conquest. Elian carries the blood of the old healers, and under my protection, that gift will remain here, serving this pack and this territory, exactly as it was always meant to." Lord Edmund's confident expression faltered slightly beneath the king's unwavering declaration, though he recovered quickly, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "And if this court does not agree with your unilateral decision, my king, such power belongs to no single ruler to claim or withhold as he sees fit." "This court," the king said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced any further protest before it could fully form, "answers to me, not to the ambitions of a neighboring lord seeking to claim influence he has no rightful hold over. You came seeking rumor and left instead with truth, Lord Edmund. I suggest you accept it graciously and return to your own territory before this matter grows more complicated than either of us would prefer." The tension in the hall stretched taut for a long, uncertain moment before Lord Edmund, recognizing the futility of pressing further against such firm resolve, offered a stiff, reluctant bow and withdrew from the hall with his retinue trailing silently behind him, Garrick among them, his expression carrying something that might have been regret, as he cast one final glance toward Elian, before disappearing through the great doors. The court remained in stunned silence for a long moment after their departure, before murmurs began rising once more, this time carrying something closer to awe than suspicion, as the full weight of the king's public declaration settled over the gathered nobles and staff. Elian stood frozen amid it all, overwhelmed by everything that had just unfolded, by the king's unwavering defense of him before the entire court, by the sudden, dramatic shift from secrecy to open acknowledgement that had just reshaped his entire place within the pack. The king stepped down from the dais and crossed the hall directly to where Elian stood, ignoring the murmuring crowd around them entirely, his gaze steady and warm despite everything that had just transpired. "It is done," he said quietly, just for Elian to hear. "Whatever comes next, you no longer face it in secret." Elian looked up at him, overwhelmed by gratitude and lingering fear in equal measure, though beneath both emotions, something steadier had begun to settle deep within his chest. For the first time in his entire life, he did not feel invisible, overlooked, or unworthy of protection. He felt, standing there, before the whole of the court with the king's steady presence beside him, entirely and undeniably seen. In the weeks that followed the king's public declaration, the palace slowly settled into a new rhythm, one that still occasionally startled Elian with how completely his life had transformed. He was no longer assigned to scrub floors or carry firewood, though he continued, by his own choice, to spend his mornings in the nursery, unwilling to abandon the pups who had first brought him to this unexpected new path. Instead, his afternoons were now spent under Wren's careful guidance, learning slowly and deliberately how to understand and shape the gift that ran quietly through his blood. The pack's reaction to the revelation had been, as the king predicted, far gentler than Elian's fear had once imagined. Most among the staff and nobles alike found themselves more curious than hostile, many even approaching him with quiet gratitude for the healing he had already brought to Milo and Nora, and eventually, cautiously, for smaller acts of healing he began offering to others within the pack under Wren's supervision. Ophelia, unsurprised by any of it, simply continued treating him with the same steady warmth she always had, proud in her own quiet way of everything he had grown into. Garrick did not return to the palace guard. Word eventually reached them that he had taken a position within a smaller, more distant pack, his ambitions perhaps chastened by how thoroughly his gamble with Lord Edmund had failed. Elian felt no lingering anger toward him, only a quiet understanding that fear and suspicion had driven his actions as much as any true malice, and that some choices, once made, simply had to be lived with, rather than endlessly resented. Lord Edmund, true to the king's firm warning, did not return either, though occasional reports suggested his ambitions had simply redirected toward other, less protected territories, a problem the king assured Elian was not theirs to solve. It was on a quiet evening, nearly 2 months after the court hall confrontation, that the king found Elian once more beside the sacred fountain, the same place where everything between them had first begun. The garden was peaceful in the fading light, the fountain's waters catching the last warm glow of sunset, and Elian looked up as the king approached, a familiar warmth settling over him at the sight. "You seem thoughtful this evening," the king observed, settling beside him at the fountain's edge. "I was thinking about that first night," Elian admitted, glancing toward the water that had changed the entire course of his life, without either of them fully understanding it at the time. "I was so certain I had ruined everything, breaking the oldest law in the kingdom out of nothing more than desperation and love for two sick pups. And instead," the king said quietly, "you found something neither of us expected." Elian looked over at him, a small, genuine smile touching his features. "Several things, actually." The king reached out, taking Elian's hand gently in his own, an easy, natural gesture now after everything they had weathered together these past months. "I have given this considerable thought," he said, his voice carrying a careful, deliberate seriousness that immediately caught Elian's full attention. "The pack has come to accept you, Elian, not simply as a healer worthy of protection, but as someone essential to this palace, and to me, in ways I no longer wish to leave unspoken." Elian's heart began to race, understanding the direction of the king's words even before he continued. "I would ask you," the king said, his composed authority softening into something far more vulnerable than Elian had ever seen from him, "to remain here, not simply under my protection, but beside me, as something far more permanent than either of us ever anticipated when this began." The words settled over Elian with a warmth that spread through his entire chest, chasing away every last shadow of the fear and uncertainty that had once defined his quiet, overlooked existence within these walls. He thought of the frightened Omega who had once knelt beside this very fountain, terrified of the king's judgment, never imagining that the same king would one day kneel beside him instead, offering not condemnation, but a future neither of them could have predicted. "Yes," Elian said simply, the single word carrying more certainty than he had ever felt about anything in his life. "I would like that very much." The king's answering smile was unguarded, genuine, entirely unlike the careful composure he wore before the rest of the pack. Reserved now, Elian understood, only for moments exactly like this one. Behind them, the nursery windows glowed warm with candlelight, Milo and Nora's laughter drifting faintly across the evening garden, as Ophelia settled them in for the night. The sacred fountain continued its quiet, endless flow beside them, the same waters that had once carried the weight of an old and forgotten legacy, now simply bearing witness to something new, taking root in its place. Elian looked out over the palace grounds, over the life that had grown so unexpectedly from a single desperate choice made in the depths of one frightened night, and felt, for the first time he could clearly remember, entirely and completely at peace with exactly where he belonged. The meek Omega who had once believed himself invisible had become, against every quiet expectation he ever held for his own life, someone the whole kingdom would come to know. Not simply as a healer, though that gift would serve the pack faithfully for many years to come, but as the quiet heart beside the Alpha King's throne, proof that even the smallest, most overlooked beginnings could grow into something the old legends themselves might one day tell. And beside the sacred fountain, where it had all begun, the king claimed once more, this time with a soft and private laugh, shared only between the two of them, that he saw nothing that night. "Nothing," he said, "except exactly what he had been searching for all along."